Hi and welcome to the third episode of African Diary podcast. Unfortunately, I was supposed to have a guest for this episode, which is why it has come late, but unfortunately they didn't show. So I'm going to be recording this episode on my own, and I hope you guys can still listen. It will be on boundaries. Alrighty, so to start this episode of Conversations with Myself, I'm going to open with a quote by Mandy Hale, and it says, "It is necessary and even vital to set standards for your life and the people you allow in it." And this quote is really what got me thinking about doing an episode on boundaries, because I feel like it's definitely something I am asking more questions about as I grow older. It's something I am learning to do more of as I grow older. And if anything, it's becoming much harder because as you get to know yourself and discover yourself, you learn more about your values, about your principles, about your own standards. So it's very difficult to now suddenly try to assert those standards and boundaries with people who with already existing relationships versus with people who are just walking into your life now. It's much easier for you to say, okay, look, this is how I am or whatever. And this is very frustrating. And just from my own experience, I will try to, or maybe I will say something or do something, and then people will be like, oh, please, we know you. That's not who you are, or whatever. They will draw, some example from something in the past. And it's difficult for people to understand sometimes that people evolve, people learn from their past mistakes, people change. And it's very hard for old friends and old relationships to understand when you have changed and to allow you to change and to grow. This is one of the reasons why I don't like to keep friendships or acquaintances from certain times in my life, just because it's very hard for people sometimes to not see you in the context that they saw you before you evolved, so to speak. So just for my own sanity, I don't know how you guys fare in that regard, but I have just found it's quite frustrating to be walking a new path and just be surrounded by people who remind you of who you were or what you did before. I feel like as humans, we guilt ourselves enough. The last thing you need is to be surrounded by people who are constantly telling you you'll never change. So, that's just one kind of branch, you could say, of setting boundaries. But yeah, I'm gonna go off to my first question before I continue to ramble. So the first question I had set for this episode is, why are boundaries necessary in a relationship? And I think, wow, there's so many reasons where to start. So boundaries are necessary, of course, for determining what kind of treatment is okay for both parties involved. What's okay for your partner to do to you, and vice versa, as well as in friendships, And I think a lot of times people are hurt and become quite bitter just from not having established boundaries. Even in working relationships, with co-workers or bosses or whatever, there needs to be boundaries, and you need to be assertive about setting your boundaries straight. And that this is something I've had to learn the hard way, because when you don't assert your boundaries, it's easier for people to either wittingly or unwittingly take advantage of you and just really do what they like and kind of treat you in a way where they don't consider the consequences of it because you haven't really explained if there are any consequences, you know? So, yeah, no, it's absolutely vital and necessary to have boundaries just to protect yourself, really, but also to protect the people around you, to, you know, keep them in your good graces or whatever, or just live peaceably with each other, you know, because if the boundaries have been laid out, I mean, for example, in the beginning of a relationship, if you're not talking about your boundaries and expectations and all that kind of thing, then it's probably not a serious relationship, because that's going to be part of the foundation of your relationship. And I think some of these rules, unspoken rules that apply to romantic relationships, should also apply to friendships. And I think a lot of these lines are crossed in friendships, and people never have these kind of conversations with their friends to say, okay, this is okay, but this isn't. For example, you know, I've had friends who are hell-bent on telling me what to do, you know, and it could be a situation where someone is living vicariously through you, or I don't know, they think they're giving you good advice. But if you don't actually set that boundary to be like, okay, look, I understand we're different people, I understand we do things differently, but I would appreciate it if you didn't do this, that person's not going to know, because you haven't asserted that boundary to say, look, my personal decisions are my decisions, and you don't always have to speak to what I do or tell me what to do, you know. So yeah, I've really walked a journey with learning to articulate myself, and being able to maintain a relationship past the point of having asserted a boundary. I think that's also another challenge. Often people will suffer in silence because they're scared of how their words will be interpreted. Even in a working relationship, you know, maybe your boss acts inappropriately or something. Many people kind of live in fear. They're like, oh, but if I say something, then maybe I'll be fired or whatever. But I think for your own sanity and for your own peace of mind, it's so important to be able to speak out and to speak up. And I mean, it doesn't have to be something that is, you know, horrible. I'm not talking about maybe like sexual harassment in a workplace or whatever. It can be little things, you know. Maybe, I don't know, maybe your boss calls you anytime they like and they don't maintain, I don't know, working hours or just work protocol or stuff. So it can be little things like that. Maybe the conduct is perfect and everything is great, but if you don't learn to assert those boundaries, you're constantly going to be uncomfortable and unhappy in whatever setup you're in. So for your own peace, and also just to actually maintain good relationships with the people around you, you should be setting boundaries, and they too should be setting boundaries. And I think it's important also when someone comes to you telling you how they feel about something, or trying to assert a boundary with you, don't take it personally, because this person has probably, you know, thought about this at length, and they've considered many facets of it, probably just not based off of your actions. But this is something that they've realized they need to do for their own sanity and their own mental health, or whatever the case is. So respect other people's boundaries, and you should certainly also have your boundaries and be assertive and be able to tell people what's okay and what's not okay. So the next segment in this episode is, what are unhealthy boundaries in relationships? Again, there's so much that can be said about this, about unhealthy boundaries. Again, just drawing from my own personal experience of it, or what I have observed. First of all, unhealthy boundary number one is not having boundaries at all, and kind of being that person who's okay with everything. I've seen people even in relationships like this, like romantic relationships like this, where they want to seem like the cool, understanding partner, to the extent where they are unable to tell their significant other about how they feel about certain types of behavior. And this is very toxic. You know, even in friendships, just kind of taking whatever you get and being bitter in the end, again, very toxic. I've realized this in myself as well. I do have some relationships that can be emotionally draining. And you know, it's very tricky. It's a very difficult, it's a very thin line. That's a proper phrase, I think, to describe this, because you want to be there for your friends. You want to be an emotional support as much as you can. You want to offer advice within your abilities and within your knowledge or whatever. But when it gets to a point where it drains your own reserves, it becomes problematic. And I think that's definitely an unhealthy boundary, where you give to a point of depletion and you become emotionally exhausted, like emotionally burnt out. And I've had to learn that I can't be a savior. I had to get over kind of like a savior complex, which might sound like a very narcissistic thing to say, because, you know, it's like, oh, what do you think? You're like people's savior or something. Not even like that, but I don't know. Maybe it's just about my personality, but my friends in general feel very comfortable to tell me about anything, and I'll just, you know, listen and give a word of encouragement or whatever I can. But sometimes it can get emotionally exhausting, and I find it very difficult to tell someone that, look, I'm going through something right now and I'm not in a good place to talk about this, because then I feel like I'm being selfish. But at the same time, not saying that to a friend is more is more harmful. It causes more harm than good in the long run. And it's difficult, you know, because I think just as people, it's very easy to take things personally. I mean, I know I do quite a lot, you know. If someone is unable to be there for me when I need them to be, I might feel like they don't value me as much, or they don't care about my struggles. And I often forget that other people are also going through a lot, you know. And I think another unhealthy boundary that stems from that is then getting to a point where you withdraw completely. And I think this is especially harmful in a romantic relationship, where you withdraw completely, and then it's kind of the exact opposite, you know, kind of from the oversharing and talking about everything to just withdrawing completely, because you feel like, I don't want to burden this person, and I'm always, you know, discussing my issues, or I feel like every day there's a problem, you know. So both extremes are toxic and unhealthy. And I feel like it's important to find a balance, not only in romantic relationships, but I think also, you know, in friendships, in family setups, in whatever social interactions you're having with people. There needs to be balance, because anything in excess is bad. So, and I mean, this gets tricky when you're talking about romantic relationships, because in a sense, you want your partner to be someone that you can talk to about anything. But at the same point, you have to realize that your partner cannot be everything you need. So for me, for example, I have to realize that I have sisters, you know, I have a mom, I have a dad, I have friends. You cannot put all your weight on one person, in as much as they might have an idea of what you're going through or whatever it is that's getting you down. You can't burden one person with everything, in my opinion. I guess, I don't know, maybe in a marriage setup it's different, because I mean, your burdens are my burdens. But yeah, I think it's important to realize that the people in your life all play different roles, and, you know, spread the load, so to speak. Because when you pile that onto one person, that's unhealthy for both of you. Because they can also become bitter and tired, whether it's a friend or partner or whatever. They can become tired from, in a sense, bearing your burdens. Again, I say, like with a marriage relationship, I feel like that should be different, because essentially when you're getting married to someone, you are taking on their burdens to be your own, and vice versa. Or at least you should. But yeah, recognizing that there are more people who can be there for you and who can help you through things is important. And I feel like this is also a truth that's becoming more apparent to me. But if you need to see a therapist, you need to see a therapist. You can't expect your friends, your partner, or your family to be your therapist. Sometimes you need the professional help, and there's absolutely no shame in going to therapy. I feel like, coming from an African perspective, you know, it's not something that is very common for us in our culture, for a person to go see a therapist or a psychiatrist or a psychologist. But we need to start normalizing that as part of being human. You know, there's a reason why that's a profession. And there have been people who have sought out therapy and really gotten the help they needed that they couldn't have gotten from just talking to a friend or whatever. So yeah, I think, yeah, that's definitely an unhealthy boundary, just literally turning someone into your therapist when they're not really qualified for that. Because, man, some people really go through heavy stuff, and it can be too heavy even for you to bear, and you won't always know what to say. You don't want a situation, for example, where someone commits suicide after opening up to you about something, and then you live with that guilt all your life. And I think there is a place to suggest to a friend or a partner or whatever to see a therapist if you feel like the problems they're dealing with are too hectic for you or an unqualified person to bear. And you can still be there for someone in that way. I think another unhealthy boundary actually is taking on too much than you can bear. You've got to be honest with yourself and with the people in your life as much as you can, for the sake of the relationship also, and just being able to continue to relate to each other well. So yeah, that's what I think about unhealthy boundaries. I'd love to hear what you think about this. So you can follow me on Instagram. My handle is africanadiary_YouTuber. And you can let me know what you think about unhealthy boundaries. What in your opinion are unhealthy boundaries in relationships? And I'm not, again, just talking about romantic, but friendships, family setups, everything. Alrighty. The next segment. Is cutting people off ever justified, or it's an excuse to avoid difficult conversations or confrontations, or perhaps a dishonest appraisal of one's own faults? This is an interesting question. I feel some type of way about the concept of cutting people off. I don't agree with it, because I do feel like no one is perfect. I certainly am not perfect, so I don't see why I would have to cut someone off unless if they're an ex or something like that. But there is a place for distancing yourself from certain people, especially if they display behaviors that are not in line with your own values and principles. Do you always have to tell them when you do this? No. I don't think you do, because that's just unnecessary drama. I personally do not like confrontation, and so I try to avoid it at all costs. But you can start to limit the time that you spend talking to a certain person, or time that you spend in their presence, if they rub you off in some way. But I feel like, it depends. If it's something that is serious and that is really bothering you or making you bitter, then you should talk about it with the person, not just cut them off, because that doesn't help anyone, and you'll probably continue to harbor the bitterness in your heart, and they will also be hurt because they won't know why you suddenly cut them off. So I don't think it's ever justified. Well, I'm laughing because I just remembered some instances of people that I've cut out, and I felt like I was justified in doing so. But perhaps I wasn't, perhaps I wasn't. But in the moment, I felt like I was. But I feel like I would have dealt with the situations differently if it was happening now. I feel like I would have had a more open heart to talk about things and just have good standing with people. Even if you're not all buddy-buddy anymore, but just to have a conversation and say, okay, you hurt me in this way, and you made me unhappy in this way, and this is why, etc., etc., So, I feel like there are a few cases where it could be justified, but that could just be me trying to justify myself for doing this in the past. So, I guess that doesn't really count. Yeah. And I had said, is this perhaps a dishonest appraisal of one's own faults? Probably, because I feel like a lot of times the things that we would cut other people off for are things that we probably have done to someone else in the past. That's not always the case, of course, because I can tell you that there's things that people have done to me that I would never do to someone, or let alone to them, especially if it's a person you consider a friend. So I think when you just think of humans as being erred, like all human beings, then you are more gracious to forgive, because you are not perfect yourself. So again, I think it goes back to honest conversations and distancing yourself rather than cutting someone off. And that's really all I have to say about this cancel culture type of mentality. The last segment is, how can a person communicate boundaries to family, friends, or partners, etc., etc.? And I think the answer to this question is simple: by communicating. So I've figured out for myself that sometimes it depends on the person and the situation, but it's sometimes easier to write a text message versus meeting in person or having a phone call, because it's easier for me maybe to go through what I need to say if I'm writing it versus if I just have to say it off the top of my head. I've realized that having face-to-face meetings, for example, about serious things tends to leave me not saying everything I want to say, maybe because I feel intimidated, or I forget, or I'm derailed by the other person's questions, versus if you sit down and think through your points and write them down, it's easier to communicate. And I think especially with situations that can easily become heated, it's better to text, because then you can also control what you say. Well, to a certain extent. I think the disadvantage of texting is obviously not being able to read someone's tone sometimes, and not really being able to, hearing someone and hearing how their voice sounds, their body language, their facial expressions, just the whole shebang of communication. It's, possibly the ideal way of communication. But like I said, it depends on this person and the situation. Sometimes an email or a text or something like that could be more helpful, especially if you're trying to deal with someone who is much older than you. I think it can be often more respectful to write things down than to have this heated conversation that can turn nasty. I also like voice recordings for dealing with serious things, because I think it gives you the opportunity to say your piece, and then the other person can also hear the tone of your voice, and they can also kind of think through what you've said and then give a response. So yeah, there are quite a lot of limitations in a sense with one-on-one meetings sometimes, depending on the issue. And then there's other times where one-on-one or one-to-one meetings are what's needed. For example, if you're confronting someone about something, I would suggest meeting with them in person or video calling them, because then you can see, their body language, and often body language will tell you a lot about how a person feels about, or geez, the words have run away. It's been a long day, but I hope you get what I mean. Just in the context of communicating boundaries, for example, if it's one-on-one and you are telling a person how you feel about a certain misconduct, I think it's easier to see if you're in person if they are taking you seriously, or if they're just discounting it as invalid, or if they're not honoring your emotions. Versus text, I feel like sometimes you can just say what the other person wants to hear, or you can say okay when you really haven't been listening. How many times do you respond to a message without really having read it properly, especially if it's a very long message and you're not invested in the conversation, which is a sad reality. I'm pretty sure that this has been a situation for a lot of you. But yeah, I think it just takes wisdom to assess the situation. Assess the situation, the person that you're talking to, and the situation, as in the matter at hand, to be able to see what the best approach is. But in any case, you have to communicate. You have to say something. You have to be honest and say it like it is. Don't mince your words. Don't be rude either. You can still resolve conflict lovingly, and you don't have to burn bridges just to get a point across. I feel like that's all I've got to say on that subject of how to communicate boundaries. Again, if you guys have any more tips on how to do this, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me on Facebook and on Instagram. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me for this episode.